valuing and procuring personal data. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be speaking here. So not about actually a specific research project, but instead I opted for a very high-level overview of this question that I've been thinking about, which does have some research in it, about how do we think about assigning economic value to pieces of like personal data, and then markets for purchasing that data. And I'm thinking of anything from things like browsing and location data, all the way up through like medical records. And my motivation is that these things could do create a lot of value, both financial and societal. But I want to start from a standpoint where people have agency and control. Okay, so they get to decide, do I reveal my information or do I choose not to? And if I do, maybe I want some compensation in return for that. Okay, and I want to think about this sort of hypothetical world and think about how things might work in that world. Okay, from an economic lens, but also I want to think what's different about like data and machine learning that makes this problem different from like procuring Pokemon cards and so on. Okay, so in part one, I'm going to give a perspective on this question of what it might mean to own personal data in a way that it could be bought and sold. And that raises this question of how should or how might people and firms assign value to this data and decide how much money they want, for example. And I'm just thinking about some baseline responses to these questions, really. It's very early. And then in part two, my answers to those questions will go into some research projects that I'm going to describe, but only at a very high level, about how you might design markets to efficiently acquire data. In part three, I'm going to step back and motivate why you might think this is a good idea for society and how this question might fit in our societal context. And I'm saving this motivation discussion for the end because hopefully that limits, how much like ranting and raving I can do before I get cut off, which is good.
So first of all, I'm not sure that it's the right term to own the personal data.
That's all part one. That's
No,
all.
saying
That's all.
The question is not to own who has the rights to the data. Right?
I mean, I can give you, but yeah. This is what I have, a talk for.
After the overview, we can start.
This is exactly the problem, right? Because if you say buy data, does that mean that you own it? And I want to try to give you a perspective on exactly this problem you're raising. And you're probably going to think I'm wrong and have other perspectives, I hope. I don't know if we'll have time to discuss them all, but I'm thinking of this as starting points for conversations. Okay, so often we think of the word ownership as meaning possession, right? Like I own my bike because it's here. And we know that information doesn't work that way, right? It can be copied, it can be shared, it can be moved all over. So I like a definition, maybe you do too, of ownership in this sense as the power of sort of exclusive control, right? So I own my data, if that even is meaningful, to this extent that I can control where my personal information is, who gets to use it, and for what purposes and at what times. Okay. And so in terms of legal frameworks, for physical objects, it's kind of clear, like possession and control are very closely related. For information, right, if we want to think about legal frameworks for control, and I'm only thinking very abstractly about them, then we have to define what that means, right? And we have to create legal frameworks for what does it mean for someone to have control. And so I'm actually going to touch on this precedent of copyright, and I'm going to try to think about a sort of analogy there. So with copyright, if I write a song, right, then I have the power to control what other people do with that information, right? So I can control whether or not Stephen is allowed to perform that song. I can control whether or not Jamie is allowed to resell copies of that song or not. Okay, and now I can start thinking about buying and selling this information in the sense of buying and selling rights to use it, right? So I can sell the copyright, but I can do more interesting things, right? I can sell rights to use this information in limited ways, right? So I can sell Stephen the license to perform the song, but only on the harmonica and only on Tuesdays and only in like New York subway stations, right? Which is our usual arrangement. And I can sell to someone else, or I can give someone else the right to resell copies of the song, but they have to pay me a royalty per copy. So that's actually the template for how recently I've been thinking about what does it mean to own personal data. It could mean to have control, right? Control over who gets to use that information for what times, for what purposes, and I might be able to sign contracts where they pay me for the right to use my personal data in certain ways. So that's how I've been thinking about it. And it doesn't have to follow the exact template of copyright, so you can think of all kinds of changes. It might not be legal for me to cede certain kinds of control over my personal information. It might not be possible for a company to even be allowed to resell or reshare personal information, whatever that means, and it's a whole can of worms. The duration might be limited, so they can only purchase a right to use my data for a year. If Facebook wants to keep using my photo or keep using my browsing history, after that year, after it expires, they have to come back to me and renegotiate. Or they come to my representative, right? So I might be part of a data union that's negotiating with Facebook on my behalf. Right, so you can imagine all these things. You can also try to think about things like ties and genomic data, like Solon talked about. But actually, even though I wanted to throw this perspective out there, and maybe it's coming at you out of the blue, for the research I'm thinking about, and so far I'm thinking about this in a very limited sense. So I'm just going to be thinking really about a single firm approaching people one at a time and saying, I want to use your data for this purpose for this period of time, and I'm willing to pay you a one-time fee. And do you agree or do you not agree? Okay, and that can look sort of functionally very similar to a current world where a company comes to you and says, I'll pay you to, donate your medical data to a survey or something.
Can I just?
Yes, please.
You might get to that, but just so that I understand where you're coming from. At first, I loved the music analogy, and then very quickly I realized the way the data is generated, though, is often very different.
Like by an interaction or...
Right, you couldn't even produce the data without already interacting with the one that then would want to like. So in a way, it's like a joint composition.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah. And it's ties and genome data are other examples of sort of joint.
Right.
And I haven't really thought through a lot of these issues. Like there's tons of them. So I'm thinking of this, really simple setting needs a lot more thought. Yeah. And in part 3, I'm going to try to step back and think a little bit more about some issues. Okay, so if you're accepting this, at least a simple setting where someone is paid for a one-time use of their data or something, it raises this question of value. So how should they assign value to this interaction? How much money do I want before I reveal my browsing data or my medical record? Yeah.
And not to delay too much, but it's not clear to me that there is a meaning to using data once.
Yeah.
So I trained my machine learning algorithm on it. Was that one use? Do I then get to use
Yeah.
an
Agreed.
algorithm or no?
Agreed. And I was kind of hoping to rush through before all these.
Yeah.
They're all. This raises all kinds of really interesting questions that again I haven't fully thought through. I'm thinking a lot about examples like medical surveys. So a hospital or a company wants to do a survey with my medical data and draw some conclusion, or possibly you could say train a differentially private model, and then they get to use that model for whatever, and they want to pay me to use my data for that purpose.
Okay.
That could be an example.
Then they can do whatever they want to subsequently.
That could be an example. In the Facebook example, I'm thinking more like they want to target ads based on my browsing history. I'm going to let them continue doing that for 1 year. After 1 year, any model they use my browsing history to train has to be deleted, and they can no longer use my data for those purposes. So that's a different answer to your question. I think all these answers are possible. And you can either think it over some more and ask later, or you can discuss some more now.
I like this. I mean, I guess just to tie this into a point Mireille was making in her talk, like it's for a lot of these kinds of the ways people would want to delegate like use of their data, it's not clear we have a language for articulating like which uses are okay, like this sort of behavioral nudging, versus just offering me like more reliable predictions about things I should, whatever, getting whatever it is that the good things I can get out of some big system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, related to that, this is kind of, as soon as you start coming up with policies that, you're putting the monetary part, but without the monetary part, the access control community has thought a lot about this, which I'm sure you know, but one of the things that the usability community has said is that for users to confront policies is equivalent to asking them to do a programming task. Right, so there's a lot of, I mean, it kind of follows from what Adam is saying, I think, that not only did we don't have a good language, but even the languages we have are incomprehensible to
Yeah,
users.
yeah.
It's
How does
way
a
too
person?
complex.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. Okay. So I want to think about if someone is, for example, providing their medical information or providing even their browsing history, how they might assign value to this. And I'm just going to give some very baseline and I hope unsurprising starting points for that kind of discussion. So one could be possible harms that are being incurred from this revelation. So the more harm that's going to come to me by participating, the more compensation I want to offset that. Right? And this could be harms because I think targeted ads will harm me, or because I think the data is going to be leaked, and so on. The cool thing about differential privacy, of course, is that it can give me some promises to remove these frictions. Right? So if I'm participating in a differentially private mechanism, it can help me remove this. But there are still interesting questions and problems. So for example, you might worry that companies can't really credibly commit, at least in the current world, to the centralized model in the sense that they're not going to either get hacked or get a new CEO and change their mind about Epsilon or so on. So there's lots of interesting questions and problems there. The other possible way, of course, is to think about the possible profits that I could make from this information. I'll finish that thought. So, for example, my data labor union might be bargaining with different people who each want to purchase exclusive rights to use history. Because if they're the only one who gets to purchase access to this information, it's very valuable. Okay, so then I might be holding out for more, and that can raise the amount of value that I can get for use of my information.
Just a question, is this idea that we're folding harms preemptively into the price, and therefore we don't need other mechanisms to deal with harms? Or what is it? How is this in relationship? Like, am I giving up my right to have legal remedy if I'm harmed by selling?
So maybe this will help answer your question without answering it. I'm going to try to do some game theory and microeconomic theory. So I'm going to think about this economic world where the only things that matter in this hypothetical world are sort of economic value that people assign to things, and they're acting in that way. I'm hoping that by studying this from a theoretical perspective, it'll help you think about those questions, which I'm not qualified to. Okay, yeah. Oh, so a nice thing for us to do theory is that I think for these simple interactions, we can maybe model this value as a sort of willingness to sell or not. So, the company says, or the hospital says, I want to use this data for this purpose. Do you agree or not? And if you agree, if I offer you this compensation, yes or no? We can think that maybe the person has in their mind some level of acceptable compensation. And that's a nice sort of layer of abstraction, because I can assume people act that way maybe, and then try to think about how markets would work. But there's also theory, and hopefully there'll be more, that say, well, would people act that way? And if so, how would they come up with these thresholds? Right? So if they have some value for privacy and I'm using a private mechanism, some researchers look at this, like a value for epsilon or something. Okay, and then also baseline sort of answers to a question of how would a firm think about this decision to purchase, and like how much money should they pay for data? Like how valuable is this data to the company? Okay, I think there's this generic answer, which is that if you're doing decision making and a piece of information helps you make better decisions, then you can sort of measure the improvement in utility in decision making, this value of information and stuff. Okay, for example, browsing history might help a company better target ads, and then they get more profit and they can measure that. In general, for a single piece of information to trace through this long process and measure that seems very infeasible. So, the firm wants some proxy at the point of deciding whether to buy the information or not to say what is the value going to be. And so I'll just mention to you how I'm thinking about this and the projects I'm about to describe, how they're thinking about it. So we're going to train a machine learning model on this data, let's say, or a hypothesis. And I can measure how good this hypothesis is with a loss function or with an error rate. And now I can ask, if I were to acquire a piece of data, and I get to train on that additional data, it'll improve my model. Right? It'll improve my hypothesis. And if I can measure that improvement, then I can say how much sort of how valuable, in a sense, that piece of data is to my machine learning process.
But then the importance of that decreases as you progress through the training process, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
beginning
This is a really interesting question, which I'm not touching on today, and I'll try to expand on your question to make sure it's clear. If the company already has 1 million data points, the marginal value of that million first data point, you could argue, is extremely small, or you can quantify it.
For a particular computation.
For a particular purpose, yeah. So like a very specific purpose, and I'm measuring value with this loss function. But now you could argue that all of those million people are the millionth data point, in a sense, right? Like for each of them in a negotiation, I say, well, I already have 999,000 agreements. You're the millionth data point, you mean your value is almost nothing to me. And that can be a big problem. And you can think about that as you see how I address the problem, but it's important.
But that's only true if all of the data points are valued equally, right? So
Yeah. And so that's part of where I'm going next. But it also suggests that this idea of collective action could be really important. This collective bargaining could be really important. But now I'm thinking from the firm's perspective, different data points will cause different improvements.
Right.
And if I'm given a certain budget to spend procuring data, then I can use these relative improvements to think about relative value, at least of the data, and say, I want to acquire this, I'm going to pay more for this and less for that.
So just as a footnote, so in the survey statistic world, where data collection is very expensive, and we basically already purchase data in a way, not that we pay the person who provides the data, but the data collection process itself, we have to pay for that, right?
Yeah.
And so what you're just describing is in place under the label of responsive design. We are trying to anticipate what's the expected contribution of a particular data point to decide whether we spend the money on that or go to a cheaper route. So
Awesome.
there's precedence for that. I'm happy to share that.
Yeah, that'd be really great. And I'll be curious to hear how you think it interacts with the approaches we're doing to solve what may end up being a very similar technical problem.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Okay. So part 2, I want to, oh wow, all right. I'll describe maybe one of these research projects. So this is with Jake Abernethy, Yiling Chen, and CJ Ho. And we're thinking of, for example, people have their medical record, and this hospital or company wants to purchase their data to, for example, build a classifier for whether someone's at risk for a disease or not at risk. Okay. And so this is the part of the talk where I cite the organizers, which is always good, right? So there's some research where this data is sort of more statistics, like average height or something. And there's this challenge that the data is correlated with willingness to sell, and I'm sure the literature mentioned has to deal with these kinds of challenges. So if I walk around offering $5 for medical records, I don't expect the data I get to be very representative, right? So there's this correlations of valuable data may be more costly. And the solutions in this theory tend to be things like using randomization to sometimes offer large amounts of compensation and sometimes low. You get biased data, but you try to debias it and use importance weighting. The thing that we are trying to do differently is first think about somewhat more general machine learning settings, and second, try to, as we were saying, use the value of the data to the machine learning algorithm to offer different amounts and try to focus on procuring valuable data over less valuable. And I'll give you an example. This is an example of trying to implement that.
Okay. I guess another line of related work that I don't actually understand very well is this sort of Shapley value of data.
Yeah.
Are you going to get in?
I'm not going to.
Real connection there, or is it just like a keyword matching?
No, I think so. So yeah. I have some familiarity with this idea of Shapley value of data. So I have a whole bunch of data points. They've all contributed to something with a good error rate, and I'm trying to assess each of their contributions. And Shapley value comes from fairness literature, so it might be a fair way to assess. This is kind of more of a economic mechanism way, which sort of says I'm not thinking from a fairness perspective. I'm thinking from a what can I purchase as a fairness perspective.
So
it's related.
James Zoe and his student actually have a paper at this year's ICML coming up about basically data Shapley value, they call it.
Yeah. So it's definitely an alternative approach to these kinds of things. Yeah. Okay, so we have this assumption that agents can't fabricate data, like create a fake medical record for this research. And you'll see why we need that assumption. So there'll be a sequence of rounds. The mechanism has some current hypothesis or some current machine learning model. And based on that, it posts some menu of prices. And it says, for different kinds of data points, I'm willing to pay different amounts. A simple example could be survey, $100 to anyone who is between the ages of like 30 and 45 and has asthma. And implicitly that poster is saying I'm paying $0 for other kinds of data. Right, is that clear? So, and you can imagine much more complicated methods. So the agent arrives, they have their secret data, which they have not revealed. They haven't given the right to use it. They decide whether this is a good deal for them based on where they fall in this offering, this menu. If they agreed, then they'll give the data, and the mechanism will pay them the price that was agreed upon in the menu. If they disagree, they go away. The mechanism doesn't get to learn or doesn't get access to their data. Okay, and then it can retrain and update to a new model and hypothesis and repeat this process. Yeah.
So should I think of this as doing an online version of like Aaron and Katrina's paper from back in the day? Is it about
Possibly.
You kind of like update your hypothesis and prices? Is it something like that?
Possibly, but I'm not sure which paper. Maybe it's one of the ones I mentioned. But
it is, yeah. The like take it or leave it.
Yeah, a big difference. Yes, so it's an online take it or leave it. It's closer to Aaron's paper with Grant Schoenebeck because we're not doing any differential privacy for one thing.
Okay.
But yeah, it's this take it or leave it framework in this bit more of a machine learning setting than a statistics averaging setting, but the technique is really close. Yeah.
Does the mechanism learn that an agent decided not to give data?
So in our technical model, yes, and that's a great question because it leaks some information, the fact that they decided not to participate. The other mechanism doesn't have that problem. Oh, also the fabrication problem. Right? If I can create a medical record that is 37 years old with asthma, then I get $100. So that's a big problem for this. For the other mechanism, it's actually also not a problem. Yeah, I should mention, we need to formalize this threshold of willingness to pay. So we're thinking of that as a cost for revealing, and this take it or leave it technique is very similar. And if their cost is below, then they'll agree, they'll take the payment. Okay, and once you do that, you can do some theory that I think I'm going to skip, but you're using value of the data to try to decide how to set these menus, and that's the only takeaway that I want to mention. Good. Yeah.
One more question. In this case, do you update prices at every time step T, or are they?
Yeah. So at every time I look at my current model and I say, what would be valuable data for me today? Sort of marginally valuable. And I offer to pay more for that in these randomized ways. And the bounds you get depend on the amount of budget you have to spend. Right?
So the value of my data does not depend on the data given by others?
It does because the history.
Only in the history?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we only know how to analyze this sort of one at a time thing rather than doing some group batch thing. Yeah. So I think I'll just skip the second project, because I think I want to say some controversial stuff in a discussion, and I think people enjoy that. It looks pretty similar. We're using ideas from things called prediction markets, which I'm avoiding the temptation to go into. But it's using this idea of, improvement in loss is how I'm going to measure the value, and I'm going to pay people for improvement in loss. You can add differential privacy to this. So you can use a sort of continual observation technique to protect differential privacy of these hypotheses that you're revealing over time. Okay. So all that is like theory world, and now I want to think a little bit about like whether this would be interesting and useful in real world. But I'm not trying to sell you something. I have like concerns as well as hopes. So yeah. So the argument for why you might take this approach, which is kind of different from a lot of privacy regulation, is kind of the same arguments that people make for markets and for capitalism like all the time. So it's the idea that data can produce a lot of great social value. You've seen that I like these medical examples. But it can also cause harms. And we need ways to route the data to the places where it does good while preventing it from doing the harms, or by compensating for those harms so that the overall effect is positive for people. And people claim that markets seem to be good at doing this in ways, especially when we don't have information about what people want. And if you start from the standpoint where people are endowed with the right to control their data, so they have this valuable endowment, it could actually be very redistributive in terms of wealth and very egalitarian. So I think that's the argument someone would try to make, someone such as me, for why this might be a good idea. Okay, I have this whole rant about data being capital. I'm curious if people heard of this idea, like Glenn Weil has a chapter in his book of data as labor. I know some have. I feel like I need to go on this rant because, so I'll tell you why I think this difference is important. So labor is work that we do for a wage, and then the company owns the result. Capital is some resource, this is my definitions. Capital is some resource that creates value, okay, and continues to create value, possibly unbounded value. Okay, so they're thinking about some things like crowdsourcing, which isn't personal data. It's not necessarily privacy issues. They're thinking about data production, and they're saying, okay, the process of that is something we deserve to be paid for. When we interact with Facebook, we're producing browsing data, and maybe we deserve to be paid for that. They're also thinking about, okay, we have this wealthy capitalist class that is maybe exploiting the broad labor class by siphoning off their data, and this class should organize, the labor class should organize. So therefore they say, we should think of data as labor. And actually, a lot of that agrees with everything I've been saying about compensating people for information. So it's like 99% agreement. It's just the title is like kind of unfortunate in the sense of being incorrect. Because data is definitely capital, right? It's definitely this resource that is valuable. And the reason I think that's important is that if you acknowledge or agree that data is this valuable resource, and if you think people have some sort of ethical right to control over their data in a financial sense as well, like be compensated for how it's used, then you should worry that, I think you should worry that these sort of one-time fees, the idea that I'll pay you once, can be exploitative. So the analogy I try to use is you wouldn't argue for music as labor, where you think bands should go into the recording studio and be paid an hourly wage, and then the company gets to own all rights to the song, and they get to make as much money as possible from reselling the song. But you would argue that in capitalism, people who own capital get wealthy. The band should get to own the copyright and make money off it. So you might actually worry that even the way we're thinking about privacy right now is disenfranchising in that way. Okay, and I'm going to try to really run through why you might think this is a good idea as well as a bad idea. And I'm going to try to list arguments without making arguments. Okay, and this will sound political, but I don't know what politics is, so I hope you'll forgive me. Okay, or it'll also sound ethical and philosophical. I don't know those things either. Okay, so you might argue people have a right to privacy and control over their data, and these kinds of ideas are a way to implement that. Okay, and therefore this is a good thing. You might further argue they have the economic right to capture some of this value that's being created by their data by companies like Facebook and Google, and capture it like financially, not just in the sense of getting free services. And this would be a way to implement that, and it's good for that reason. And then I tried to describe this sort of economic argument that you might think this system creates a lot of social good, overall social welfare, and so on, and it's good for that reason. So there are different objections that I can brainstorm. One is to recognize that this method of data rights is not actually an expansion of human rights. It's actually a limitation, right? Because now I'm allowed to control, what Stephen and Jamie are allowed to do with certain pieces of information. So I've been given the power to limit their rights and the rights of companies to do things. And you might object to that on some grounds. You can have this objection that similarly, you take this sort of common good, this public good of information, and you've now privatized it and made it private property in capital, which is an approach to privacy that only an American could think of. And you might argue either morally that you don't like that idea, or you might just argue that's not the right economic system for generating welfare. You think there are better ones. And then even if you agree with a lot of these things, you can worry that the implementation of this in legislature might be a bad idea, so you might worry about regulatory capture and frictions and barriers to entry. you might think that like copyright is not a precedent that you're particularly excited about following, and how copyright law has worked. Okay, all those things. The final thing I want to mention very quickly is legal. So in terms of control over personal information, legal and regulatory routes aren't necessarily the only routes to go. So we can also try to have technical approaches that allow us to exert more control over where our information goes. So things like browsing, web browsing history, I decide not to let websites send my personal data all over the place. Like I block those, from happening. The good news is we have these technical solutions to a large extent in a lot of cases. You can either use freedom-respecting software, or you can choose not to, for example, get smart TVs that spy on you and so on and so forth. The bad news is the barriers are high. You have to be tech-savvy and have time and energy and money. But this is really a point of optimism, in my opinion, because while pursuing legal or regulatory routes, you could also pursue routes that give people more control purely by making this kind of software more available and easier to use for everyone. Okay. And I know that's a very personal opinion kind of rant, but hopefully it fits the workshop well. Okay. That was the talk. Thanks very much for your patience. The end.
Just one question while everyone is setting up.
So you had contracts on your previous slide, but you didn't get a chance to say anything about contracts. But I wanted to invite you to say something because I think this is potentially really powerful in a setting like data, where neither side of the market really has any ability to anticipate the value of what we're talking about and what we're exchanging. And maybe you want, instead of paying me 10 cents for my data, to pay me some percentage of the value that it ends up having. So do you have things to say about that?
No, I don't think I have anything more to add. That's a great direction you outlined. Very well.
If I can say just a quick point, like I think I'm curious to think about things like enforcement, because it seems like something like differential privacy, this powerful tool for protecting privacy, actually like limits our ability to enforce these things, right? If the company has my access to my data and I say, no, you can't use it, they train a model privately, now I can't tell whether you actually used my data or not.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's say continue and over.